Did you ever wonder what lurks just beyond the trees? The kind of things that watch you when you think you're alone, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Tonight, on NoSleep Nightmares Reddit, we're diving into a collection of true terror. Stories of forests that breathe, shadows that hunt, and encounters you'll wish you could forget. From a girl chased by a silent motocross rider to a clown who never stops smiling. These tales will drag you deep into the dark. And trust me, the scariest twist is still hiding at the end, like the fifth story, where the forest itself decides who lives and who doesn't. Before we begin, do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this with your bravest friends, and subscribe to NoSleep Nightmares Reddit. Help me reach 1,000 subs so I can keep bringing you more nightmares too real to sleep through. Ready? Let's step into the woods together. I grew up in the suburbs of England. Not the bustling city kind, but the kind where the houses thin out and the fields stretch wide before giving way to woods that feel older than the roads we paved over them. My parents owned a farm a short drive away, a little patch of earth where time seemed to slow down. It was my escape. And the best part, Molly, my dog. She wasn't some dainty little lapdog. No, Molly was a mutt, big and scruffy, with a coat that smelled like wet grass and a bark that could wake the dead. I loved her more than anything. Every Sunday, Dad and I would pile into the car, the engine rumbling as we left the cul-de-sacs behind for the dirt lanes of the farm. That morning was no different, or so I thought. The sky was still grey, the air crisp with the promise of spring. I was maybe 16, old enough to feel invincible, but young enough to ignore the little voice in my head that whispered, "Be careful." We pulled up to the farm, the tires crunching on gravel, and I bolted out of the car before Dad could even kill the engine. Molly was there, tail wagging like a metronome, and I threw my arms around her, burying my face in her fur. Dad grumbled, "You're gonna stink like wet dog all day." But I didn't care. She was my girl. I grabbed her leash, clipped it on, and turned to Dad. "Can I take her for a walk?" He waved me off, assuming I'd just stroll down the road and back like usual. But the road? Boring. The forest behind the farm was where the real adventure was. It wasn't some sprawling wilderness, just a tangle of oaks and brambles, maybe a mile deep, with paths I'd worn down over years of wandering. It was my sanctuary, a place where the world melted away, and it was just me, Molly, and the quiet. So we veered off the gravel, her paws crunching on twigs as we slipped into the trees. I unclipped her leash once we were deep enough. She loved to roam, sniffing every root and chasing shadows. I'd carve my initials into the bark with my pocket knife or toss rocks at stumps, pretending I was some baseball pro. It was peaceful, perfect, until it wasn't. I found this old wooden leg, probably from some busted table dumped years ago, and I was swinging it like a bat, knocking rocks into the undergrowth. Molly was off somewhere, her rustling a faint soundtrack to my game. Then I heard it, a bark, not her usual, "Hey, look, a squirrel." Yap. This was sharp, insistent, like she'd cornered something big. My stomach did a little flip, but I told myself it was nothing. A fox maybe, a badger. She'd done this before. I gripped the wooden leg tighter, not because I planned to fight anything, just because it felt good to hold something solid. "Molly, Molly, get back here," I called, my voice bouncing off the trees. She didn't come. That was the first red flag. Molly always came when I called. Always. The barking didn't stop. It got louder, angrier, pulling me toward her like a tether. I pushed through the brambles, thorns snagging my jeans, until the trees thinned into a small clearing I'd never seen before. And there she was, Molly, hackles up, barking at something. No, someone. A man. He stood maybe 20 feet away, his back to me, shirtless despite the chill, his skin smeared with dirt and sweat. In one hand, he held a machete, long, rusted, the kind you'd see in a slasher flick. In the other, a bottle, half full of some cloudy liquid that sloshed as he moved. He was hacking at the ground, each swing sending clumps of earth flying, like he was digging for something, or someone. Molly's barking didn't faze him. He didn't even glance her way. I froze, the wooden leg dangling in my hand, my brain screaming at me to run, but my legs refusing to listen. Then he stopped. He turned, and I saw his face. His eyes were blue, impossibly blue, like shards of ice glowing in the dim light. They were wide, unblinking, locked on me the second he noticed I was there. His lips curled into a grin, not friendly, not even human. Just a stretch of teeth that didn't match the madness in his stare. "Come here, girl," he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. "Look what I've dug up." I didn't want to look. Every instinct I had was yelling at me to grab Molly and bolt. But those eyes, they pinned me in place. I edged closer, keeping the wooden leg raised like some pathetic shield, my sneakers sinking into the mud. The hole he'd been hacking at was shallow, maybe a foot deep, and empty. At least, that's what I thought at first. He went back to swinging, the machete thudding into the dirt, pausing only to swig from his bottle. I took that chance to whistle for Molly. She stopped barking, trotted back to me, and I started backing away, slow and quiet, praying he wouldn't notice. Then I made the mistake of looking back. His head was in the hole now, like he was sniffing it, or listening. I held my breath. He jerked upright and I nearly screamed. Clamped between his teeth was a bone, long, cracked, stained yellow with age. Not a deer bone, not a fox bone. Something bigger, something that made my skin crawl. He laughed, a wet guttural sound, and I saw it. The machete flying through the air, spinning end over end, landing somewhere in the trees behind me. "Damn it," he roared, and that was it. I ran. Molly was right beside me, her paws pounding the earth as we tore through the forest. Branches whipped my face, snagging my hair, but I didn't care. I just kept running. I knew those woods like the back of my hand, every twist, every hollow. I wasn't afraid of getting lost. I was afraid of him. That laugh echoed behind me, bouncing off the trees, making it impossible to tell how close he was, or if he was even chasing me at all. I didn't stop until I hit the garage, slamming the door shut and collapsing against it, my chest heaving. Dad was there, tinkering with the tractor lights, humming some old tune. He glanced up, frowning. "You okay, kid? You look like you've seen a ghost." I wanted to tell him everything. The man, the machete, the bone. But the words stuck in my throat. If I told him, he'd never let me walk Molly again. He'd lock me in the house and throw away the key, so I just nodded, muttered something about tripping, and dragged Molly inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the farmhouse sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind was that laugh, clawing its way back to me. I kept Molly close, her warm bulk pressed against my side, but even she seemed restless, her ears twitching at noises I couldn't hear. I told myself it was over. He was just some drunk, some lunatic who'd stumbled into the woods and stumbled out again. I'd never see him again. I was wrong. A week later I went back. Stupid, I know. But I couldn't shake it. That image of him, the bone, the hole. It gnawed at me, a splinter I couldn't pull out. I had to know what he'd been digging for. Molly came with me, her leash clipped tight this time. The forest felt different, thicker, darker, like the trees had grown closer together overnight. The air was heavy, sour with something I couldn't place. We found the clearing again, the hole still there, wider now, like something, or someone, had kept digging. The machete was gone, but the bottle lay shattered nearby, its contents soaked into the dirt. I knelt by the hole, Molly whining at my side, and peered in. That's when I saw it. More bones. Not just one, but a dozen, maybe more. Ribs, vertebrae, a jawbone with teeth still clinging to it. Human teeth. I stumbled back, my hands shaking, and that's when I heard the hum. Low, steady, like a chant carried on the wind. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was everywhere, seeping from the trees, the ground, the air itself. Molly growled, her fur bristling, and I saw them, shapes in the shadows. Not people, not quite. They were tall, thin, their limbs too long, their heads cocked at angles that made my stomach lurch. They didn't move closer, just watched, their eyes glinting like coins in the dark. I grabbed Molly and ran again, but the forest wouldn't let me go that easily. The paths I knew twisted, looping back on themselves, spitting me out in places that didn't make sense. Clearings with stones arranged in spirals, trees marked with symbols I couldn't read. The hum grew louder, vibrating in my skull, and those shapes, they followed, always just out of reach, their whispers tangling with the wind. By the time I stumbled back to the farm, the sun was setting. Dad was furious. I'd been gone for hours, not minutes. I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. "You're imagining things," he said. "Too many horror movies." But Molly wouldn't go near the forest after that. She'd sit by the door, staring out, growling at nothing. Or maybe at something I couldn't see anymore. Months passed, and I stayed away. But the forest didn't forget me. It started small. Scratches on the farmhouse windows, too high for any animal to reach. Footprints in the mud, barefoot and human, circling the barn. Then the dreams. Me, standing in that clearing, the man with the machete grinning as the ground split open, spilling bones and shadows that crawled toward me on hands that weren't hands. One night, Molly vanished. I woke up to an empty bed, the back door ajar, a trail of paw prints leading to the trees. I grabbed a flashlight and followed, calling her name, my voice swallowed by the dark. The forest was alive that night, branches snapping, leaves rustling. The hum, now a roar that shook the earth. I found her leash first, torn in half, then her collar, smeared with something black and sticky. And then I saw it, not the man, not this time. It was taller, its body a patchwork of bark and bone, its face a hollow where eyes should have been. It held Molly's limp form in one claw-like hand, her fur matted with that same black ooze. I screamed, lunging forward, but the ground erupted beneath me, roots, thick and pulsing, wrapping around my legs, dragging me down. The thing didn't speak, didn't move, just watched as I clawed at the dirt, sinking deeper. I don't know how I got free. One second I was drowning in roots. The next I was sprawled on the farmhouse porch, covered in mud, my flashlight gone. Molly was gone too. Dad found me there shaking, and this time, he believed me. We moved a month later, left the farm, left the forest, left everything. But I still hear that hum some nights, faint and far away, calling me back. That was 9 years ago. I don't know what I saw in those woods. Whether it was a man gone mad, or something older, something that wore his skin like a mask. I don't know what it wanted with Molly, or with me. But I know this, that forest isn't empty. It's waiting, for me, For you. For anyone dumb enough to step inside. So next time you're out walking your dog, listening to the birds, feeling the sun on your face, listen closer. If you hear a bark that doesn't come back, or a hum that doesn't fade, turn around, run, and don't look back. That was just the beginning, folks. A quiet Sunday walk with Molly turned into a nightmare of machetes, bones, and a forest that hides more than it shows. But the woods aren't done with us yet. Up next, we're jumping to 2016, when the killer clown craze swept the UK, and one unlucky soul found out those painted grins aren't always a prank. What happens when you're alone in the dark and the laughter starts chasing you? Stick around to find out. If that first tale sent a chill down your spine, do me a solid. Smash that subscribe button for NoSleep Nightmares Reddit and drop a comment below. What would you do if you stumbled on that machete man? Let's keep the terror rolling. It was October 2016, and the UK was buzzing, or maybe trembling, with a killer clown craze. You remember it, right? People dressed as clowns popping up in alleys, on roadsides, wielding knives, or just standing there, grinning like they knew something you didn't. The news called it a prank epidemic. Social media called it a horror movie come to life. Me, I called it a bad omen. I was 19, living in a quiet corner of England, where the suburbs bled into farmland and forests that felt like they'd been there since the world was young. That night, I was headed to a party. Not some big rave, just a gathering in the woods, a secluded spot kids like me used to drink cheap beer and pretend we were rebels. It was about a mile from my house, through a stretch of trees I'd walked a dozen times before. I didn't think twice about going alone. It was 10 p.m., the sky a solid sheet of black, and the air crisp with that autumn bite. My phone was my only light, the flashlight app casting a shaky beam over roots and rocks as I trudged along. The forest wasn't creepy, not usually. It was familiar, almost cozy, with its mossy paths and the distant hoot of an owl. I'd grown up playing there, building forts, chasing friends through the undergrowth. But 2016 had changed things. The clown sightings were everywhere, on TV, on Twitter, whispered between classmates. Did you hear about the guy in Leeds? What about the one with the axe in Bristol? I laughed it off. Urban legends, I told myself. Dumbasses in costumes trying to go viral. Nothing to worry about here, not in my little nowhere town. I was wrong. I'd taken a shortcut, a long, winding stretch through the woods with no real path, just a vague trail of trampled grass I'd memorized over the years. It was faster than the main road, and I liked the quiet. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Texts from friends at the party. Where you at? Bring snacks, I smirked, typing a quick reply when I heard it. A snap. Not a twig under my shoe. Something heavier, off to my left. I froze, the beam of my flashlight jerking toward the sound. Nothing. Just shadows swaying in the breeze, trees stretching into the dark. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a fox. Happens all the time out here. But my pulse was already ticking up. That primal little alarm in the back of your brain that says, you're not alone. I shook it off and kept walking, faster now, the party's distant laughter pulling me forward. Then I saw him. He was sitting on a fallen log, maybe 50 feet away, half hidden by a cluster of pines. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, moonlight glinting off something weird, making shapes where there weren't any. But I aimed my flashlight, and there he was, a clown, a big one. His costume was tattered. Red and white stripes faded to a muddy pink, pom-poms dangling like rotten fruit. His face was painted white, smeared with black around the eyes and a red grin that stretched ear to ear, too wide to be human. He didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there staring at me, his hands resting on his knees like he'd been waiting all night. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some kid in a Spirit Halloween get-up. He was huge, 6 foot something, broad as a linebacker. And that smile, it wasn't painted on. It was real, carved into his face, like a jack-o'-lantern left to rot. I fumbled with my phone, trying to call someone, anyone. But my fingers were shaking too hard to hit the right buttons. "Hello," I croaked, my voice thin and pathetic. He didn't answer, just kept smiling. I didn't wait for him to move. I turned and bolted, my sneakers slipping on wet leaves as I sprinted back the way I'd come. The forest turned hostile, branches clawing at my jacket, roots snagging my ankles like they wanted me to fall. My phone slipped from my hand, the flashlight beam spinning wildly before it hit the ground, plunging me into near darkness. I didn't stop to grab it. Every second I hesitated was a second he'd gain on me. The moon was my only guide now, its pale light filtering through the canopy, casting jagged shadows that danced like they were mocking me. I heard him then, heavy footsteps crashing through the undergrowth behind me. Not running, not yet, but steady, deliberate, a predator's pace that said he didn't need to rush. He knew these woods. I could feel it in the way the air thickened, the way the trees seemed to lean in, their gnarled fingers brushing my shoulders as I tore past. My breath burned in my chest, ragged gasps tearing from my throat, but I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. The party was still ahead, laughter, music, safety, but it felt a million miles away, drowned out by the thud of his boots and the pounding of my own heart. I risked a glance over my shoulder, just a split-second twist of my head, and regretted it instantly. He was closer now, lumbering through the trees, that grotesque grin glowing in the moonlight like a beacon of madness. His costume flapped as he moved, those faded stripes rippling like torn flesh, the pom-poms bouncing with every step, absurd and terrifying all at once. He wasn't fast, but he was relentless, his long legs eating up the distance with a calm that made my stomach lurch. And those eyes, black voids under the paint, locked on me, unblinking, like he could see straight through to the fear clawing at my spine. My foot caught on something, a root, a rock, I don't know, and I stumbled, arms flailing as I fought to stay upright. Pain shot through my ankle, sharp and hot, but I didn't dare stop. I pushed off the ground, mud caking my hands, and kept going, the forest blurring into a tunnel of green and black. The footsteps grew louder, closer, a rhythmic thud, thud, thud that synced with my pulse, driving me forward like a hunted animal. I could hear him breathing now. Or maybe it was something else, a low, guttural wheeze that didn't sound human, rising from the dark like the woods themselves were exhaling. Ahead, the path narrowed, flanked by a barbed wire fence, rusted and sagging, its jagged teeth glinting in the moonlight. It wasn't much, but it was my only shot at slowing him down. I threw myself at it, scrambling over, the wire snagging my jeans and slicing into my palms as I hauled myself across. Blood slicked my hands, warm and sticky, dripping onto the ground as I clawed my way to the other side. I hit the dirt hard, my knees buckling, but I scrambled up, spinning to face him. He'd stopped at the fence, towering there, his massive frame silhouetted against the trees. That smile, God, that smile, stretched wider, splitting his face in two, his head tilting like he was savoring the sight of me bleeding and broken. I backed away, my hands throbbing, my ankles screaming with every step. He didn't climb the fence, not yet. He just stood there, one hand resting on a post, the wire creaking under his weight. I pretended to be on the phone, shouting into the night, "Yeah, I'm almost there, hurry up. Get out here now." My voice cracked, high and desperate, but I hoped it'd fool him, make him think I wasn't alone. It didn't. He took a step forward, the fence groaning as he pressed against it, and I saw his fingers, long, bony, smeared with something dark, curl around the wire like he could rip it apart with a flick of his wrist. Panic clawed at my throat. I turned and ran again, hobbling now, the pain in my ankle a white-hot spike that shot up my leg with every stride. The forest seemed to twist around me, the path stretching longer than it should have, the trees closing in tighter, their branches scraping my face like skeletal hands. I could still hear him, those footsteps, that wheeze, fainter now, but not gone, never gone. I kept running, tears stinging my eyes, until the flicker of the bonfire broke through the dark, the party's noise crashing over me like a lifeline. I burst into the clearing, gasping, my hands bleeding, my clothes torn, and collapsed against a log as faces turned to stare. He didn't follow me in. Not that I could see, but I knew he was still out there waiting. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. My hands were bandaged, the cuts deep enough to need stitches, but I refused to go to the hospital. How do you explain something like that? Oh yeah, a clown chased me through the woods with a smile that'd make a corpse flinch. They'd lock me up in a psych ward before I finished the sentence. So I stayed home, locked in my room, the curtains drawn tight, jumping at every creak of the house settling. The clown thing was all over the news by then. Sightings in Manchester, a machete-wielding freak in Kent, even a grainy video of one standing under a streetlight in Glasgow, staring at the camera until it cut to static. Everyone had a theory. Pranksters, a cult, some twisted ARG gone too far. I didn't care what it was. I just knew what I'd seen. And it wasn't a game. Those eyes, black pits under the grease paint, haunted me. They weren't human, not even close. And that smile, it wasn't just wide, it was alive, twitching at the corners like it had a mind of its own, like it could peel off his face and crawl toward me. I kept replaying it, the way he'd sat there still as death, then stood up like he'd been waiting for me all along. My friends at the party laughed it off. "You're just freaked out by the clown hype," they said, passing me a beer I couldn't even hold with my mangled hands. But they didn't see him. They didn't feel that weight, that certainty that he wasn't done with me. A week later, I went back to the woods, not to face him, just to find my phone. Dumb, I know, but it had my life on it, photos, texts, proof I wasn't crazy. I waited until daylight, the sun high and bright, figuring he wouldn't dare show up then. The forest was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears until they ring. I found the spot, the log, the fence, the muddy patch where I'd fallen. My phone was gone. In its place was a single red balloon, half deflated, tied to a root with a piece of twine. I didn't touch it. I just ran, the balloon bobbing in my peripheral vision like a taunt. I moved to the city a year later, London, all concrete and noise, thinking the bustle would drown out the fear. It didn't. The nightmares started then, vivid and relentless. I'd be back on that path, the air thick with fog, the clown waiting on his log. But now, he wasn't alone. Shadows moved behind him. Other clowns, their costumes shredded, their faces smeared with paint and something darker, circling me like wolves. I'd run, but the path would loop, spitting me back to him, his grin wider each time, his hands reaching out with fingers that bent the wrong way. I'd wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat, my hands stinging like the wire was still cutting into them. Then the letters came, handwritten, no return address, slipped under my door in the dead of night when the building was silent. The first one just said, "You ran fast." 3 words scrawled in black ink, the letters jagged like they'd been scratched with a nail. I burned it, told myself it was a prank. The second came a week later, a smiley face, drawn in red, the mouth a crooked slash that bled into the paper. I moved my couch against the door that night, didn't sleep a wink. The third arrived with a photo. Me, that night, mid-sprint. My face pale and twisted in terror, the background a blur of trees. Someone had been watching, filming, and they'd tracked me down. I went to the police, my hands shaking as I handed over the photo. They barely looked at it. "Kid's messing with you," the officer said, tossing it on his desk. "File a report if it escalates." Escalates, I wanted to scream. What did they call this? I started hearing things after that. Giggles, soft and high-pitched, drifting through the walls of my flat. Footsteps in the hall that stopped when I yanked the door open, finding nothing but an empty corridor. Once, I woke to a tapping on my window, 3rd floor, no balcony, and found a smudge of red paint on the glass, streaked like a finger had dragged it down. I stopped going out at night, quit my job, lived off savings, kept the lights on 24/7, but the fear didn't fade. It grew roots, burrowing into my skull. I'd see him sometimes, in crowds, at the edge of my vision, a flash of red and white, a glimpse of that grin, gone when I turned. I told myself it was trauma, my mind playing tricks, anything but the truth. He wasn't done with me. He'd never be done. And then, one morning, I found it. A balloon, red and shiny, tied to my doorknob with a single strand of barbed wire. The metal rusted and flecked with dried blood. My blood. I didn't call the police again. I just packed a bag and ran. Last month I went back. 9 years later, 28 now. I thought I could face it, prove to myself it was over. The forest was still there, unchanged, like time didn't touch it. I drove out at dusk, parked at the old trailhead, and walked in, a flashlight in one hand, a knife in the other. The air was thick, sour, like something had died and festered. The log was still there, moss-eaten and crumbling. I sat where he'd sat, my beam sweeping the trees, daring him to show up. Nothing, just silence, too much silence. No owls, no wind, no life. Then the ground shifted, not an earthquake, a pulse like the earth was breathing. I stood, my knife trembling in my grip, and saw it. Paint. Smears of red and white on the trunks, fresh and wet, forming arrows pointing deeper in. I followed them, stupid, I know, drawn by something I couldn't name. The path twisted, the trees bending inward, their branches knitting together until the sky was gone. The paint turned to words. Run again. I see you. Smile. Then I found the clearing. It wasn't empty. Balloons floated there, dozens of them, red and white, bobbing on strings tied to stakes in the ground. Between them stood figures, clowns, motionless, their costumes ragged, their faces painted in that same grinning mask. But they weren't people. Their limbs were wrong, too long, too bent, and their heads twitched like puppets on frayed strings. In the center was him, taller now, his smile wider, his eyes blacker, holding something in his hands. My phone, the one I dropped that night, its screen cracked but glowing with that photo of me running. The ground pulsed again, harder, and the clowns moved, jerky, unnatural, closing in. I slashed with my knife, cutting strings, popping balloons, but they kept coming, their giggles rising into a screech that split my skull. The forest floor cracked open, roots writhing like veins, and I saw it. Faces, dozens of them, buried shallow, their mouths stretched into smiles, their eyes gone. Victims, prey. I ran, the knife lost, my flashlight flickering out. The giggles chased me. The ground buckled. But I made it to my car, slamming the gas until the woods were a smear in my rear view. I didn't stop until dawn, parked in some empty lot, shaking, the taste of blood in my mouth from biting my tongue. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't gone back. I can't. But the giggles haven't stopped. They're outside my window now, every night, soft as whispers, loud as screams. Last night, I found a balloon on my porch, red, shiny, with a note. Next time, you won't run. The clowns of 2016 weren't a prank. They weren't human. They're something older, something the forest keeps, feeds, sends out to play. And they don't forget a face. The clown's grin is still out there, etched in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. 2 stories down, and the forest is proving it's no place for the faint of heart. Next up, we're shifting gears, literally, to a countryside where a 13-year-old and her loyal dog, Henry, thought they were safe, until the roar of a motocross bike turned their walk into a desperate fight to survive. Who or what was behind that helmet, and why won't it let her go? You won't want to miss this. If these tales are keeping you up at night, help me keep the nightmares coming. Subscribe to NoSleep Nightmares Reddit and leave a comment. Ever heard an engine in the dark that didn't belong? Let's see what you've got. I was 13 when it happened, living in a sleepy countryside town somewhere. I won't say where, because it doesn't matter anymore. We'd just moved there, my parents and me, into a house perched on the edge of a massive forest that stretched out like a green sea behind our backyard. It was new, unfamiliar, a fresh start after a rough patch in the city. The neighborhood was small, half-built, with empty lots and skeletal frames of houses still waiting for walls. The forest, though, it was alive, ancient, a labyrinth of oaks and pines that seemed to hum with something I couldn't name. I wasn't thrilled about the move. School was a nightmare, new kid, easy target, the usual bully crap, but the forest, that was my escape. I'd take my dog, Henry, out there every chance I got. Henry was a beast, 7 years old, black as coal, built like a tank with a bark that could rattle windows. People crossed the street when they saw him coming, which suited me fine. He was my shield, my shadow, and I didn't need anything else. Not a phone, not a weapon, just him. My parents didn't mind me wandering off with him. He'll keep you safe, they'd say. And I believed it. That day was typical. Bright, warm, the kind of afternoon where the sun hangs lazy in the sky and the bugs buzz like they're gossiping. I'd had a lousy week at school, some jerk named Kyle shoving me into a locker. So I grabbed Henry's leash and headed out. The forest was my therapy, a place to shake off the world. We'd walk for hours sometimes, me kicking rocks, him sniffing every tree like it was a treasure map. Nothing ever happened out there. No people, no danger, just quiet. Until that day, we were deep in the woods, maybe an hour in, following a dirt track used by motocross riders, or so I assumed from the tire marks etched into the earth. It wasn't a real path, just a ribbon of packed soil winding through the trees, but I liked it. Henry was off leash, bounding ahead, his black fur a stark contrast to the green around us. I was lost in my head, replaying that locker shove when I heard it. A noise. Low at first, a faint rumble, like thunder rolling in from miles away. I stopped, tilting my head, trying to place it. It got louder, sharper, until it wasn't thunder anymore. It was an engine, raw and mechanical, snarling through the trees. My stomach tightened. I wasn't used to company out here. "Henry," I called, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. He trotted back, ears perked, but he didn't bark. Not yet. I squinted down the track, the sound swelling, vibrating in my chest. Then I saw him. He came fast, a blur of red and black tearing around a bend, the motocross bike kicking up dirt like a storm. His helmet was dark, visor down, hiding his face, but he was big, too big for the bike. His shoulders hunched, his gloved hands gripping the bars like claws. He didn't slow down, didn't swerve, just aimed straight for me. I froze, 13 and dumb, thinking he'd stop, wave, maybe yell something about trespassing. He didn't. The engine screamed, and I realized too late. He wasn't stopping. I dove off the track, dragging Henry with me, crashing into a tangle of ferns as the bike roared past. The wind from it hit me like a slap, dirt stinging my eyes. I scrambled up, heart hammering, watching him disappear around another curve. "Jerk," I shouted, my voice swallowed by the fading growl. Henry growled too, low and deep, his hackles up. I brushed myself off, figuring that was it, just some asshole showing off, but then the sound came back. The rumble grew again, closer this time, doubling back like he'd circled around. I didn't wait to see him. I grabbed Henry's collar and ran, cutting through the trees, away from the track. Branches snapped under my sneakers, thorns snagging my jeans, tearing at my skin until I felt the sting of blood trickling down my legs. But I didn't care. I just needed distance. Henry kept pace, his bulk crashing through the undergrowth, his black fur catching on brambles. But he wasn't barking, and that scared me more than anything. He always barked at strangers, loud, fierce, a warning that echoed through the woods. Why wasn't he now? His silence felt like a betrayal, like even he knew something I didn't, something too big to fight. The engine roared louder, too close, the sound bouncing off the trees until it felt like it was everywhere. Behind me, beside me, above me, a wall of noise that pressed against my skull. My chest burned, my lungs screaming for air, but I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. The forest turned against me, roots jutting up like traps, vines curling around my ankles as if they'd grown alive in that moment, eager to hold me back. I risked a glance back, stupid I know. And there he was, off the track now, weaving between the trunks, the bike's tires chewing up the forest floor, spitting dirt and leaves in a violent spray. His helmet tilted toward me, visor blank, reflecting the green blur of leaves and the pale flash of my own terrified face. He wasn't just riding anymore, he was hunting, and I was the prey. I bolted for a big rock I'd seen before, a mossy boulder half buried in the dirt, its surface slick with damp and decay, big enough to hide us if I could just get there. My sneakers skidded on wet leaves, my hands clawing at the air as I stumbled, nearly falling, but I shoved Henry behind it, his warm bulk pressing against my side as I crouched low. My breath hitched, coming in shallow, ragged bursts, and I pressed my back against the stone, its cold seeping through my shirt. The engine snarled past, so close I felt the vibration in my bones, the ground trembling under me. I peeked out, my heart slamming against my ribs, and saw him sitting there, maybe 20 yards away, head turning slowly, scanning the trees with that blank, faceless stare. He didn't call out, didn't rev the bike, just waited, like he knew I was close, like he could smell the fear pouring off me. Henry whimpered, a soft, pitiful sound, and I clamped a hand over his muzzle, my fingers trembling as I pressed too hard, praying he'd stay quiet. His eyes, big, brown, usually so steady, darted to mine, wide with something I'd never seen in him before. Panic. The engine cut off. Silence hit like a punch, thick and suffocating, wrapping around us until the only sound was the blood rushing in my ears. Then I heard boots, heavy, deliberate, crunching on leaves, snapping twigs with a slow, measured rhythm that made my stomach twist. He was off the bike, walking now, closing in, each step a hammer blow against my fragile hope. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing him to pass, to miss us. But the crunching stopped too close, too soon, and I felt the air shift, heavy with the scent of gasoline and something sour, like sweat or rot. I couldn't stay. I bolted again, dragging Henry, my legs burning as we sprinted through the trees, weaving between trunks that loomed like sentinels in a nightmare. I tripped on a branch, went down hard, my knee slamming into a jagged root, pain exploding up my leg like fire. I bit my lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood, and hauled myself up, mud caking my hands, my jeans, my face. The forest wasn't dense here. He could see me. I knew it. And the engine roared back to life, closer than ever, a mechanical howl that drowned out my gasps. I veered into a thicker patch, trees crowding tight, their branches clawing at my arms, my hair, hoping it'd stop him. It did. He couldn't follow on the bike. But the footsteps came instead, fast and relentless, pounding the earth like a drumbeat of doom. I found a ditch, shallow and choked with dead leaves, and ducked into it, pulling Henry close, his fur matted with dirt and sweat. The crunching stopped above me, and I saw his shadow stretch over the edge, long, distorted, the silhouette of a man who wasn't a man anymore. My breath caught, tears streaking my face, mixing with the mud as I pressed myself deeper into the earth, willing it to swallow me whole. He stood there, motionless, for what felt like hours, then turned away, the footsteps fading. I waited, counting seconds, 10, 20, 100, then crawled out, shaking, and ran again, not stopping until I saw a half-built house, a construction site, empty but real, its skeletal frame a promise of safety. I hid behind a fence, my body trembling, watching him ride past in the distance, slow and searching, his helmet glinting in the fading light before he finally vanished into the trees. I got home, scraped and bruised, my knee swollen and throbbing, Henry panting beside me like he'd aged a decade in an hour. My clothes were torn, streaked with mud and blood, and my hands shook so bad I could barely unlatch the gate. I told my parents everything, the engine, the chase, the man who wouldn't stop, but they didn't believe me. "You're exaggerating," Mum said, her voice soft but firm, brushing it off as a kid's wild imagination. Dad just nodded, half listening, more worried about the scratches on my arms than the story behind them. "Probably some biker lost his way," he muttered, handing me a damp cloth. I didn't push it. What was the point? They hadn't heard the engine, hadn't felt that weight pressing down on me. I cleaned up, locked my door, and stayed out of the forest after that, sticking to the yard, the streets, anywhere but there. Henry wouldn't go near the trees either. He'd sit at the edge of our property, where the grass met the woods, staring into the shadows with his ears flat, growling low in his throat at nothing, or maybe something. I'd watch him from the porch, my stomach twisting every time his hackles rose, wondering what he saw that I couldn't. He'd always been fearless, chased off stray dogs, barked at delivery guys until they dropped their packages and ran. But now he was different, quieter his big brown eyes darting to the tree line like it was a threat he couldn't name. I started keeping him inside at night, his bulk curled up by my bed, but even then, he'd wake me with soft whines, paws twitching like he was running in his sleep. Years later, when I was 16, I heard rumors, whispers from kids at school, stories passed around like contraband. Weed farms hidden deep in the forest, guarded by guys who didn't mess around, armed with more than just bikes. Cameras too, tucked in the branches, watching the trails for intruders. Maybe I'd stumbled too close that day, tripped some silent alarm, crossed a line I didn't see. It made sense, kinda, but it didn't explain the way he'd chase me. Relentless, silent, like it wasn't about drugs or territory. It was about me, about the thrill of the hunt. I asked around once, casual-like, but no one knew anything solid, just shrugs, and heard it from my cousin tales that went nowhere. The nightmares started when I was 15, vivid and cruel, sneaking into my sleep like thieves. I'd be back in the forest, the air thick with mist, the engine roaring somewhere close but unseen. The bike was different in the dreams, rusted, jagged, dripping with something black and oily that pooled on the ground, stinking of decay. The rider's helmet was cracked open, not showing a face but a void, a swirling darkness that sucked in the light. I'd run, my legs heavy, tripping over roots that pulsed like veins, hiding behind rocks that crumbled under my hands. He'd always find me, his gloved hand reaching out, cold and wet, brushing my neck before I'd jerk awake, screaming, my knee aching like I'd fallen all over again. I'd lie there, panting, staring at the ceiling, the echo of that engine lingering in my ears long after I opened my eyes. When I was 17, I went back with friends, older, braver, armed with flashlights and bravado, determined to prove I wasn't scared anymore. We found an abandoned shack, not far from where it happened, its walls rotting, windows smashed, the roof sagging like it was tired of standing. Inside were motocross tires, old and slashed, rubber peeling away in strips, and a helmet, dark, scratched, just like his, sitting on a broken table like a trophy. My friend laughed, kicked it, said it was junk left by some burnout. I didn't touch it, didn't even get close. The air in there was wrong, stale, heavy, with a faint hum I couldn't place, like an engine idling miles away. We left quick, but that night, I heard it, faint, outside my window, a low growl that rose and fell with the wind. I yanked the curtains open, heart pounding, but nothing was there, just the empty street, the dark trees swaying in the distance. It didn't stop there. Things started showing up, little things at first. A tire mark in the mud by our mailbox, fresh and deep, when no one in our house rode. A glove, black leather worn, left on the back steps, its fingers curled like it had been dropped mid-reach. I burned it, watched the flames eat it up, but the smell stuck in my nose for days, sharp and chemical. Then the sounds, scratching on the walls at night, soft and rhythmic, like metal dragging on wood. I check, flashlight shaking in my hand, but find nothing, no marks, no tracks, just Henry growling at the dark. I stopped sleeping with the window open, stopped looking out at all, but I couldn't shake it. The forest remembered me, and it wasn't letting go. I'm 19 now, and I thought I'd moved on, left that town, that forest behind. But last week, I went back. Call it closure, call it stupidity. I had to know. I drove out at dusk, parked near the old trail, and walked in, a flashlight in one hand, a crowbar in the other. The forest was different, darker, denser, the air heavy with rot. The track was still there, overgrown, tire marks faded but visible. I followed it, the silence pressing in, until I heard it, a rumble, low and distant. My blood ran cold. I gripped the crowbar, scanning the trees, and saw headlights, 2 pinpricks of yellow cutting through the gloom. The engine roared, and he came, faster than before, the bike a skeletal thing of metal and shadow, the rider hunched, his helmet gleaming like wet bone. I ran, the forest twisting around me, paths looping, trees bending to block my way. The engine was everywhere, behind me, beside me, inside my skull. I tripped, fell into a hollow and saw it. A pit, filled with bikes, rusted husks tangled with roots, and helmets, dozens of them, staring up like skulls. He stopped above me, silent, his visor reflecting my flashlight beam back at me. The ground pulsed, roots curling up, wrapping my legs, pulling me down. Something else moved, figures, thin and jagged, stepping from the trees, their bodies fused with metal, their faces hidden behind cracked visors. They didn't speak, just reached, their hands cold as steel. I swung the crowbar, broke free, and ran, the engine chasing me, the forest screaming with wind that wasn't wind. I made it to my car, floored it. Didn't stop until I was miles away, shaking, the crowbar still clenched in my hand. That was 6 days ago. I hear it now, the engine, faint at night, outside my new place. Last night, I found tire marks in the dirt by my door, fresh and deep. The forest didn't let me go. He didn't let me go. And there you have it, folks. 3 tales of terror woven from the shadows of the forest. A machete-wielding madman, a clown who hunts with a smile, and a motocross rider who never stops chasing. But here's the thing. These woods aren't finished with us yet. What else is hiding out there, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to step inside? Maybe it's a secret we've only scratched the surface of, a final twist that ties these nightmares together. And trust me, you won't see it coming. If you've made it this far, you're one of us now. So hit that subscribe button for NoSleep Nightmares Reddit and join the sleepless. Drop a comment with your favorite story, or better yet, tell me what you've seen in the dark. We've got more horrors waiting, and I'll see you in the next nightmare. Sleep tight if you dare.